Okay, I'm on, but I just like to test a little bit first. Can you all hear me? Would somebody go to the chat and let me know that I am, like you can hear me as well as see me. George, thanks for letting me know that you can see me. Can you hear me? Thank you. Thank you, Norbert. Thank you, Kyle. Oh, and Jack. Oh, thanks so much. This is actually working. I don't generally consider myself technically challenged, but this is new for me. So I see by my computer clock it's 1 o'clock p.m. So I'm going to, it's Central Time, my time, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm going to go ahead and get started so we can stay on time. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mary Ruwart. I'm a research scientist by profession and best known in the libertarian world for my award-winning book, Healing Our World, which is now in its third printing, or fourth printing, haven't quite kept track. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, you can get a free download of the original version at my website, which is www.ruwart.com, spelled just like my name, RUWART.com. Now, I did notice that when the other speaker was talking, that if she made a lot of facial gestures and a lot of hand gestures like I just did, there's a lot of jerkiness, so I'm going to try to minimize that and try to still be entertaining here. You know, my topic today is about the how we can win without winning elections, basically, how we can get the libertarian change that we want. And I think what I'm going to say today is going to be interesting both to party members and to those who feel that political action, or at least party action, is not appropriate. And to get started on that, I just wanted to know that I welcome everyone here, regardless of your bent on that. And I am going to actually, I'm really delighted with this talk today and delighted that you've come, because I'm really going to try to suggest a new strategy that's really been out there all the time for us, but that we have, at least I have, certainly, and the Libertarian Party as a whole, I believe, has overlooked. It's where our power is, and we have a lot of it. We just haven't really taken note. So that's what we're going to cover today, and that's extremely good news. But first of all, before I give you the good news, I have to give you the bad news, in part because obviously if we're going to change our strategy, we need to know that it's important to do so, and not something that, you know, we're just doing to do. That wouldn't be any good. So let me start with the information that we got, very good information from the 2008 elections. You know, in that election, we had several things happen that we never had happen before. Let's talk first about Louisiana. In Louisiana, the only liberty-minded candidate on the ballot was Ron Paul. If you really wanted to register a protest vote, you had to vote for him. He was running as an independent in that state, and the LP presidential ticket did not get on the ballot. So really, Ron Paul was the only choice you had. Now, it should have been a pretty popular choice, because Dr. Paul had actually gotten 1 to 2% of, I'm sorry, he got in first or second place in the Republican primaries, depending on whose vote count you listen to. And I'm assuming, as I talk about this, that all the vote counts were right, which we know may or may not be true, but I don't think we can make any other assumption. So Dr. Paul, since he was first or second in the Republican primaries, should have had a pretty strong showing in Louisiana. We might have expected several percent, maybe even double-digit returns. But he got a disappointing 0.4%, which was what the Libertarian presidential ticket did across the nation. And what that says is that people who really had Ron Paul as their first choice weren't willing to vote for him at the polls if they perceived that he didn't have a chance to win. This is the wasted vote syndrome. And truly, if anyone was going to overcome it in the 2008 election, it should have been Dr. Paul. So the fact that he only got 0.4% suggests that the wasted vote syndrome is very much alive and very much a part of the election process in our country, at least for the presidential candidates, and probably for our local candidates as well. Now, we got some other interesting data that supports what I just said in the last few minutes, and that is that we had a unique LP presidential ticket. We had a former congressman who had had several terms, who was very well known for some of the legislation he had passed, and had great name recognition, especially in his state. Now, you might remember when Dr. Paul ran in 1988 for our nomination, he had also sat in Congress, but he had nowhere near the notoriety and name recognition that our presidential candidate in 2008, Bob Barr, did. So we had great hopes for Bob Barr, and we were thinking that maybe that would work. It was a whole different direction that the LP took. Somebody with name recognition, somebody who had served in Congress for several terms, and someone who was maybe a little bit controversial, so that might have actually helped us. Well, let's take a look at how he did. Now, as I said, overall, he got the same result throughout the nation that Ron Paul had gotten in Louisiana. And that 0.4% wasn't even the top that we've ever gotten. Obviously, we had 1% back in 1980, but even since then, we've had some candidates who've done 0.5% or close to 0.6%. So 0.4% wasn't a particularly remarkable outcome, in spite of these wonderful characteristics that Bob Barr had, which incidentally included getting probably more media attention than any other candidate we've had to date. And I understand from the vice presidential candidate, Wayne Allen Root, that he believes he got more publicity and media than any other vice presidential candidate. So if this is true, we finally had lots of media, something we've longed to have. Yet in his home state of Georgia, where Bob Barr campaigned quite rigorously and did a lot of visiting of different universities and events, where his name recognition was high, he was getting about 0.8%, which was certainly better than 0.4%, but still it was, I would say, disappointing for what we had hoped. And what's interesting is that in Texas, where Bob Barr, I think, made 1 or 2 appearances, he got 0.8% as well, even though he didn't campaign rigorously there. It wasn't his home state where he had great name recognition. He got 0.8%. Well, why did he do that? Well, I have a theory. Texas was one of the most active local parties, state parties, ran a record number of candidates that year and got the libertarian name out there. And it may be that when someone was convinced by a local candidate to pull the lever for libertarian, they also were more receptive to pulling it for our presidential candidate. Now, this theory is supported by the data from Indiana, the state where Bob Barr got the most votes. In Indiana, he got 1.1%. Now, if you think about it for a moment, that large percentage was really surprising, because I'm not sure that Bob Barr ever went to Indiana to campaign, certainly not rigorously. But Indiana also had a very big slate of candidates and has been very active for several years, just as Texas has. I would say on a per capita basis, Indiana was even more active than Texas. And certainly the 1.1% suggests that our presidential ticket rides the coattails of our local candidates, not vice versa. So there's a lot of things that we learned from this election. First of all, we learned that our presidential candidate doesn't support the local candidates so much as the opposite, and that the wasted vote syndrome, as indicated by Ron Paul's poor performance in Louisiana, unfortunately is still extremely strong. In fact, when you think about how strong it is based on these numbers, you can really wonder if we ever can get enough people in Congress to turn the tide in time. How many congressional representatives or senators are we going to need to make a big difference? Well, certainly Dr. Paul has been calling attention to a lot of the problems as the lone, I would say, the lone or almost lone libertarian voice in Congress, but he hasn't really been able to do much than slow things down. If we want to turn the tide, we're going to need many more people in Congress, and if we have the wasted vote syndrome to deal with at the level it seems to be working, I don't see that happening in the near future. And that's the bad news. And if you look at it from the standpoint of the way the Libertarian Party currently thinks, it is bad news, because throughout our history we have been arguing about whether we should be an educational organization or whether we should try to win elections. If you look at it that way, it's really bad news. But the thing is, it's a narrow way to look at it. I'm going to suggest that there are more than two options, and that this is where we've fallen down and missed the chance to use our power to have action today to stop the state. I don't think we need to get elected to do it. And now I'm going to tell you why I believe that and how I think that we can do it with the power that we've generated, both through the movement itself, educationally, and with the party by all its attempts at running candidates and trying to win elections. So let's talk about that a little bit. Why do I think that's possible? Well, I got a very big hint in the early 80s, and I didn't get it. And as I tell this story, I think many of you are going to be saying the same thing. In 1983, I and 3 other libertarian candidates ran as a slate for city commission in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Now, it's a nonpartisan office, but everyone knew we were libertarians because the establishment figured that it could defeat us by pointing that out. And we ran on a pretty solid libertarian slate. We called it the Taxpayers Protection Slate. Our main issue was getting rid of the high taxes that were in Kalamazoo, and we're really forcing people out. You know, when I'd go to doorbell, as I often did, the elderly people there would tell me that they had saved for their retirement, they had paid off their home, but now they were forced to sell their house and move because what had happened was, even though they had paid off their mortgage, the property taxes had gone up so much that they now were bigger than the mortgage payment that these people had been faced with. And so they were essentially paying another mortgage, a bigger mortgage on their house. They couldn't afford it. Of course, it wasn't really a mortgage, it's property taxes, but it was so huge they were having to sell and leave. So this was a very big issue in Kalamazoo. Now, even though we did not win the election, we did, as a slate and as individuals, fill the next few slots. There were 8 seats that were on our city commission, and basically those slots were filled once again by the establishment. But there were 2 other slates running, and we came in right after the establishment slate. We were very popular. This was the first big run in Kalamazoo. Now, we did actually get 2 political appointments out of that. The mayor, who was very sympathetic to our slate, and actually we put him on our slate because, at least in the issues facing the city, he was libertarian, actually became the mayor because the highest vote getter was the mayor, and his vote total matched what our slate had gotten. Usually it's a couple votes difference between the different city commission candidates, so who's mayor is kind of, you know, arbitrary, but this time he clearly had a landslide victory because of our slate. So he appointed myself and one other person from the slate to the Public Safety Task Force. This was a citizens committee that was supposed to be working with the police and improving safety, and really wasn't much of a committee, but nevertheless, by by incorporating him in our slate, we did get, I think, what might have been the first 2 political appointments for libertarians in the nation. Now, that was fine, but that didn't change how things were going in Kalamazoo very much. But something else did. That came directly from the fact that we had run for office and that we had a very blatantly libertarian campaign where we pushed the libertarian principles very strongly. And this is an interesting story, which I'm sure many candidates can tell as well, and with a little bit different facts and figures. But shortly after the election, we had a situation where the city felt that it wanted to do this big rail consolidation project, which is a big boondoggle. It would have taken our little town of Kalamazoo, I don't know what we had, 50, 60,000 people when the students from Western University were in town, and have a massive rerouting of roads, overpasses and underpasses, so that nobody would have to wait for the train to go through the city. Even though the train, which took about 10 minutes to go through the city, it was already illegal. All they had to do was find the train, and I'm sure other things would have happened. But they didn't want to do that. They wanted to do this boondoggle for their friends. So not only were they going to do this huge building, they were going to go ahead and take land by eminent domain. Now, some of this land was a bribe to my employer, actually, the Upjohn Company. What was going to happen is that, so the Upjohn Company would go along with it. They were going to take all this land for the rail consolidation project and hand a big chunk of it to Upjohn to soothe their conscience, shall we say. Upjohn was the biggest employer in the area. If they could get Upjohn to go along with it, everyone would. Now, I worked for the Upjohn Company, so it was my employer that was getting the big break from all this. And yet, when I went to a meeting where citizens were discussing this eminent domain and this rail consolidation issue, I had a gentleman, an older gentleman, come up to me, and he put $200 cash in my hand. This is the early 80s, remember. That was a lot of money back then. And he said, "Dr. Ruwart, I know that this eminent domain business is going to benefit your employer, but you're a libertarian. You have ethics. And I know that you'll fight this rail consolidation. Please take this money and do it, please, because part of the eminent domain grab is the bicycle shop that my brother and I own and operate and have for 30 years. We don't want to lose it." You know, that was really stunning, because he knew I had a conflict of interest, and yet he was willing to trust me because I was a libertarian, and our campaign had so emphasized principle that he believed I would take that money and fight and probably win. And that's exactly what happened. The Libertarian Party got involved in fighting the eminent domain and rail consolidation, as did other citizen groups. We weren't alone. And we stopped it right then and there. And this would have been the biggest boondoggle Kalamazoo had ever experienced. We really did something significant. And we didn't have to win an election to do it. It was important that we ran and advertised, but we didn't have to win an election to do it. Now, I've heard lots of stories about this at a local level, and it's exciting. You know, we don't have to be elected to change the course of history in our locale. In fact, it can do more than that. You know, we were talking about Bob Barr earlier. Well, many of you might not be aware that when Bob Barr lost in the primaries for his congressional seat, he did so because the libertarians had targeted him. Because he was a big drug warrior, the Libertarians of Georgia ran an ad of a multiple sclerosis victim in her hospital bed. She was elderly. She looked so frail, and she said, "Oh, you know, I have multiple sclerosis, and I'm in pain all the time unless I take my medicine, medical marijuana. And Bob Barr wants to take it away from me. Please, don't let him take away my medicine." I don't know that I'm quoting the advertisement exactly, but that was the the gist of it. And of course, you saw her in her hospital bed, and you couldn't help but feel for her. And Bob Barr went down to defeat in the primaries, an incumbent of several terms. That's power. And we didn't have to win an election to do it. Oh, we did have to run candidates. See, our candidate had to be on the, in the race in order to promote this as a, well, I guess they probably wouldn't have had to, but there was a candidate that was running and promoting this as part of her campaign. Very interesting. And of course, Bob Barr eventually joined us, which is a wonderful, wonderful ending to that story. But we didn't have to win an election to unseat a congressperson that we didn't like. Now, another story, Steve Cubbie. Many of you know him since he ran for the 2008 presidential nomination. He's a medical marijuana patient, one of the first, actually. He has a very horrific adrenal cancer. And what this cancer does, it puts out large quantities of hormones that raise his blood pressure so much that he could die in a few days without cannabis. And in fact, almost did at one point because he was put in jail for his cannabis. But he had run as a libertarian for office, got some name recognition in California, and then decided that based on that name recognition, he would put Proposition 215 into the queue in the next voting cycle. Now, Proposition 215 was the legalization of medical marijuana in California. And he was able to get that, with the help of several other groups, to get that on the ballot and passed. California became the first state to allow medical marijuana. And this started a cascade in other states, so that now 25% of the U.S. population has access to medical marijuana. And Steve right now is decided, after his latest city commission run, that he was going to use that notoriety to try again in California to legalize marijuana and treat it like alcohol. Now, of course, nobody really wants it to be taxed or anything, so he arranged it so that that isn't really in the bill. It gives the legislature time to make it so, but it doesn't put that in the bill. Steve is a true blue libertarian. He really wants to see this pass. And if it does, California will become the first state to actually decriminalize marijuana fully. As you know, last November, the bill that was slated to do that didn't pass, and Steve has rectified, or believes he's rectified, all of the different problems with that bill. Now, he's out there doing that, and got excited about doing it after he ran for office with the LP, got enough attention so that he could actually talk to people who would fund and help him. So, again, he's taken the power that he got from his election, which he lost, and he's changing the landscape of the drug war, not only in California, but by example, in the entire United States. This is major stuff, and he's doing it without winning an election, but using the power of having run and the power that gives him to help these changes along. And my view of this is it's extremely important because most of the arrests for drug crimes are marijuana. And you can see the rolling of this out is eventually marijuana is going to become legal in this country, and that's really going to mean the end of the drug war, because that's where the money is in the drug war. It's not in cocaine and heroin. It's more or less, at least for the law enforcement, it's more or less in the medical marijuana. So in the marijuana itself. So once marijuana goes medical, the next step is it will probably be decriminalized, and I believe that the drug war will fizzle out for lack of interest in the police and justice departments when there is no big bucks forthcoming anymore on that. Well, we'll see if my prediction is the case. But the bottom line here is not my prediction as much as the fact that Steve Cubbie, another LP candidate, was able to capitalize on the power that gave him to go and make big changes. And actually, if you if you followed the debate on Clinton Care some years ago, you may have noticed what I noticed, which were that the critics of Clinton Care, at least 80% of them, were from the libertarian movement. I personally recognize the names of many people. I was on the radio show many, many times talking about Clinton Care, as was the co-author of Jarrett Wolstein of the book that we put together, Lethal Compassion, where we talked about Clinton Care and how horrible it was going to be. He was on one show in particular with one of the higher-ups in government and pointed out step by step in the bill things that the government person didn't even know were in there. Made a real, well, just made the whole thing seem really terrible. And so I really believe that the libertarian movement stopped Clinton Care, never took credit for it, but really was the prime mover behind that. Now this time, with Obamacare, what's interesting is we have a lot of other voices speaking up, using the data and the information that we put out, we, meaning the libertarians, in Clinton Care, because there's a big similarity, and taking that ball and running with it. And you know, if Obamacare is defeated, it will be largely because of the libertarian movement again. You know, so we can stop programs that are nationwide and are pretty obnoxious without winning an election. But using the election cycle and using ourselves as candidates to promote the ideas of the Libertarian Party and, of course, the libertarian movement, and utilize that to let people know we're out there and available to fight these things. And then, between elections, actually put our efforts where we can actually affect major changes. So I don't think the choice anymore is between education, running races to win. It's all there in one package for us. We run candidates with the information that we got from education and tell people what we're about, get them excited about the ideas. And then when we end the election, and most of us won't be elected, it's okay, because you know what? We've built up some power base here that can be used locally or even nationally. I've given examples of all of them to stop the aggressors without necessarily winning the elections. We've had this power all the time and we haven't used it. Really. I mean, yes, we've used it some, and I know a lot of candidates can tell similar stories, but we haven't used it to the extent that we could because we haven't recognized it and promoted it within the movement and the party. And I say the movement too because I know a lot of people don't believe in the Libertarian Party, don't think we should be involved in electoral politics per se, but are very eager to work on these local issues. It brings us all together. It's a wonderful unifying concept. We don't have to have division between education and winning and all that, because it's the third alternative. Going where our power is, using both education and running candidates, whether we win or lose, to change the course of history. So I'm very excited about this, and I'd like to, I'd like to wrap up and hear some more from you, because I feel that this is something we should all be promoting within the movement. Go where our power is, and this isn't a guess. I mean, we've seen it in action at the local level, at the national level. So I'm going to switch now to my chat channel so I can read your comments and questions, and maybe we can talk more about this. I'm very eager to do so. And before I go, I really want to thank you for tuning into this. This is a great experiment, and I think it's a way that we can communicate more in the future. So let me go find my chat channel so that I can read your comments and answer your questions. Okay. Oh, I'm getting lots of great comments. Someone asked me about the FDA. Can we get around the FDA and patents by going to China? Yes, sometimes we can do that. The patent system here, as it exists in the U.S., is really, I don't know if I should put it quite this way, but It's just a game, really. When you apply for a patent today, you have to distinguish yourself from something another person did, but they don't even have to do it anymore. They just have to postulate it. They don't have to do what we call reduction to practice. You know, when I was at Upjohn, we had to kind of prove that our idea had some merit by some experiments or something. That's not even necessary anymore. So people can blue sky and do it wrong and hold up other patents that have the truth of the matter. It's crazy, and I know this because, you know, I've had to get patents. Unfortunately, and I say have to, what happens in the drug industry today is they have to get patents or they can't recover their costs. If they didn't have the patents, they wouldn't. Now, back in my day, when I first started with the drug companies, they didn't need patents. They developed a lot of things without patents because the cost of development was so low. Now that the FDA has increased that cost so greatly, only by having a monopoly is it possible, and the costs have increased so much that isn't even saving drug companies anymore. The pipeline's drying up. It's very sad. I've got a lot of other things coming here. Well, I'm getting some compliments. Thank you all for for supporting me. I couldn't do this without the level of support that I've gotten from, the libertarians around the country. So I really appreciate that. And okay, I'm getting a question, a very good question, about the blogs on lp.org. All LNC members have a chance to do the blogs, and I have to admit I have been negligent there. I've got a lot going, and I just haven't posted the way I should. So, Carol, thank you for reminding me and encouraging me. And, of course, Wayne is on the LNC, so he gets the blog too. And I don't think there's much we can do about that. So, and maybe what I will do, I may start posting blogs and things from other candidates just to kind of even things out. That might be a good way for me to use my slot. We'll see. Are there other questions? See, I hope I haven't missed anybody's. I'm scrolling through right now just to make sure I didn't. I was getting some comments that libertarians serve better when they hide out as Republicans or Democrats. Hey, I have no problem with that. You know, I was a big supporter of Dr. Paul, even though he's running on the Republican ticket this time. I think that, we all have to do what we're called to do, and we're called to do different things. Some of us are going to be called to infiltrate the other parties, if you will. That's great. Some are going to be called to stay in the LP, as I feel I am. So, I think we all need to do our thing. Let's see. Yes, there's been more questions about medicine, so let me read them really quickly so I can answer them for you. Okay, there's questions about what's going to happen with the drug industry and with medicine. And I guess I'm going to have to bite the bullet here and put out the knowledge that I have about the drug industry. I have studied it and been in it. And unless you're an insider, it is very hard to tell. It's very hard to tell what's wrong with the system. And what's wrong with the system in the drug industry is very easy to demonstrate, because in 1962, regulations were passed that overhauled the industry that are still having effects now. The effects are cumulative. And you can pretty well demonstrate them convincingly and show that about 80% of the costs of a drug on the pharmacy shelf today are due to regulations that harm us instead of help us. And the way they harm us mostly is that they increase the drug development time. It used to be about 5 years before these regulations were passed. Now it's 15 on average. So when I was doing research in AIDS, by the time the FDA gave the drug companies permission to test their drugs in AIDS patients, every AIDS patient in the country that wanted that drug had already had it. Why? They hired black market chemists to make them. They couldn't wait. They had to do it. And cancer patients recently sued the FDA about 2 or 3 years ago for the ability to buy. They didn't want them gifted. They just wanted to be able to buy drugs that the pharmaceutical companies were making and had done the safety testing in people, but they weren't yet sure if it was effective. And there's been several really good cancer drugs coming along that are so good that it was pretty obvious that they had some beneficial effects even in the safety studies, which is really unusual. And cancer patients want to buy these. But the courts ruled that we do not have the constitutional right to save our lives by buying a drug that has not been FDA approved. Now, I don't think that's going to be a real popular decision. In fact, the Abigail Alliance, and you can go to their website, abigailalliance.org, is really spearheading the fight here. They've recommended special access for cancer patients for 17 drugs, and all these drugs have eventually been approved and saved lives. And of course, in the meantime, while the FDA is wondering if it should do it, it's really, really bad news. Okay. Now, I have a request to do a YouTube presentation for what I'm talking about now. I already have that. I think it's called Deadly Secrets Behind Soaring Pharmaceutical Prices, and it was filmed, I believe, in New Hampshire. So you can get a hold of that, and I lay this all out pretty well. And I'm getting a comment that, of course, the bureaucratic unions won't allow the FDA to go down, and of course they're going to fight it, certainly. But the popular movement is kind of like the medical marijuana movement. There's a great movement to allow people to make their own choices. In fact, this is an area, if I were going to pick one area where I think that we can make major strides as a movement, is to really capitalize on the fact that people want a choice. Whenever the FDA tries to regulate nutritional vitamins, minerals, things like that, Congress gets more mail on that than any other issue. You know, we need to bring these people into the party. They've already got it in the nutritional area. We need to help them see the rest of the picture, and we haven't been very good at recruiting them. I believe that's the single biggest group that we could bring in, so I think that's something we should try for. Oh yes, and I'm getting questions about the drugging of children with Ritalin and the attempted licensing of herbs and vitamins. Yes, the way the FDA is trying to control herbs and vitamins is they want to actually make them into drugs and have them go through the same 15-year process. It's nuts, and people are fighting it. And of course, we're over-drugging our children, in my opinion. You know, the drugs have become the answer for everything. And I was in the industry, and it was very interesting because the researchers, like myself, who knew that at that time we didn't have genetic manipulation. The only way we could make our animals diabetic or atherosclerotic or have gallstones or something was to take the vitamins away. That's a big hint, right? You need your vitamins to stay healthy. So we need to have pharmaceuticals put in their proper perspective. And the 62 amendments that I talked about earlier are what created this prejudice against vitamins and minerals, and it's enabling the FDA to go after them by saying that their claims of effectiveness haven't been proven, and then try to shunt them through the whole system. We need to stop this, and I believe that we can as a movement, because the people who are very adamant about this are on our side in this. And I've been asked about Obamacare. Well, you know, there are several states that are going to be suing Obamacare is unconstitutional based on the fact that we're forcing people to buy private insurance. So we're forcing people to, in Obamacare, to buy something from the private sector that they wouldn't otherwise buy. This is really unprecedented. My fear is that what will happen is Obamacare will morph into a one-payer system, basically socialized medicine. But you see, because of the work libertarians did on Clinton Care, the country knows that this is not going to work, and they're afraid of that. So this is why they had it set up this way in the first place. So we may have tied their hands on this one. Let's hope so. Does my video contain vitamin advocacy? I think you're referring to the YouTube one that I mentioned. I believe I did talk about that somewhat, yes. I think I talked about what I just mentioned here, that the way that we used to get models for the pharmaceutical firms is take the animals' vitamins away. So I think, and I did show, I did explain, I believe in that video, how the pharmaceutical companies, which used to be the ones that were pushing vitamins and minerals. You know, one a day, multiple vitamins was really more or less the start of the nutritional revolution. That was from a pharmaceutical firm. In fact, even today, most people don't know this, but things like vitamin E, which are synthetic now, and vitamin C, those are mostly made by pharmaceutical firms because they were the ones who pioneered those techniques of manufacture and were going at it strong until the 1962 amendments, which really cut things off. I'm getting a question, why hasn't this been done with auto insurance? I'm assuming that means why aren't people forced to buy auto insurance? Actually, in some states, I understand they are. Or why hasn't it been, maybe you're asking why it hasn't been fought based on its constitutionality. And that's a really good question. I hadn't thought about that. Very good question. Thank you. I'll have to think about that some more. And I'm glad you said it in a format where I could bring it to the fore because other people may have a way to work on that angle too. Oh yeah, food additives that could be harmful. Well, again, I think in a libertarian society, if you thought something was harmful and you could demonstrate it, the companies would have to pay some type of restitution. What the problem is today is that because the FDA gets to approve these things, once it's approved, you know, you really have an uphill battle, you know, because the FDA has said it's safe, and unfortunately the FDA is not infallible. Or maybe fortunately. I guess it depends how you look at it. Oh, I'm getting a very nice email saying I'm going to get some more viewers for me. Well, thank you. Thank you. I've thought about writing a book on this pharmaceutical stuff because there's really, unfortunately, I don't know of anyone else who has the information set I do. But I've spent so much time writing books that I know what I'm getting into now. When I started healing, I thought it was going to take me a year. It took me 5. And now I'm a little intimidated because I know I can't estimate this properly. So I need to get my courage up here. And, you know, things like this help do that for me. Yes, it is harder to sue if the FDA approves. I got that question. Yes, it is. You know, you've got an uphill battle. Because the opposition says, well, the FDA said it was okay, so it must be. I'm getting a question about aspartame. Yeah, there are a lot of people who are sensitive to it. That's true for anything, really. You know, there are people who are allergic to peanuts, people allergic to the lactose in milk. We all have sensitivities. Nothing is perfectly safe. In fact, I gave a presentation to the FDA. Well, the FDA was in the audience. Part of the big higher-ups of the FDA were in the audience, and I talked about how all of these regulations and this long development time actually kill more people than they save because people die waiting for the new drugs. And it was very interesting. I think they just couldn't conceive that that was actually happening. So I don't know what to say about that. Change has got to come from outside. You know, it's got to come from the people. Okay, I got a encouragement for the book there. Just do it. Thank you. There aren't any companies other than drug companies that really can operate without FDA approval. And actually, you know, it's interesting. You ask, I've got a question if I know of any companies that access pharma as an alternative to the FDA or provide consumers with information. Actually, believe it or not, the FDA regulates the information that companies can provide consumers. You know those advertisements you see on TV where you get an ad about, if you have this problem, you might want to see your doctor. And this drug has all these side effects, and the side effects go on and on and on and on. That's because the FDA sees all those commercials before they go on, and it tells the companies what they have to do. That's what they're telling them. So it's very, very difficult for a company to properly inform the consumers. Yes, I'm getting I hate those ads, and that's, yeah. I remember when Upjohn first put out its prescription minoxidil for hair growth. We had an advertisement with a guy walking down the beach and saying something, you know, if you think certain changes have to happen when you get older, you know, you might want to check with your doctor. I mean, we couldn't even say anything about the hair growth. It was amazing. Oh, and I'm getting a good suggestion to do the book as a series of talks. That's not a bad idea. I actually started trying to do healing that way and felt it was too complex, but this might be the thing. Thank you. Good suggestion. And I get a comment, I don't watch TV anymore. I can certainly understand that. There have been years when I haven't had a TV. I'm getting a comment, I'm very happy for the FDA. It is so nice not to have to think for myself. Well, I don't know if that was a serious comment or was supposed to be farcical, but, you know, there are people who I think feel more comfortable with government approving things because they believe that government is there for them and is really out to protect them. And probably the way, if we're going to have peaceful evolution, which is what this channel is about, my guess is that the way we're going to have it is that other companies, pharma companies, vitamin companies, will start being able to put out their information and that the FDA may become redundant. So it may gradually fade. People will have the option of waiting for FDA approval for a long time or, you know, not, depending on their situation. So maybe that's the way it'll go. In fact, had these lawsuits that I talked about earlier with the cancer patients been won, what would have probably happened is people wouldn't wait anymore for FDA approval. As soon as the safety studies were done, especially the terminally ill would have bought those products, and there may never have been a full development program. And this is why the FDA fights it, because they want control. And there's just so much I could say about that, but it's very depressing. Okay. Okay, there's another problem. Doctors not telling you all the side effects. And some of course that keeps it up. Yes, well, doctors, you know what the problem, part of the problem is that, you know, when you list all these side effects, which occur in some people but maybe aren't common, there's a tendency to sort of disregard them because the side effect that every drug has almost, or can have if you're allergic to it, is death. So, you know, once you say that to a person, you know, and tell them, well, yeah, I mean, you could die, it's probably low risk. What do these other side effects mean? You know, that you've already said that for every drug, so people sort of get the idea that, oh yeah, this long list is there for every drug and it really doesn't mean anything, and then they don't pay attention. So that's the downside of doing it this way. Yes, there was a comment that it would be good to have a consumer reports for drugs and devices. Actually, before the FDA got all that power, there was something called consumer it wasn't Consumer Reports, it had another name. It's slipping my mind right now, but there was one especially for consumers, there were one for doctors and pharmacists, and there are still some journals that publish review of certain drugs. So that whole process was starting, and then when the FDA grew and got so big and heavy-handed, that stopped. Actually, the American Medical Association used to test drugs themselves to make sure that they knew what they were giving their patients. And the incidents of drug poisoning that built up the FDA, interestingly enough, were all instances where the AMA had not yet given their seal of approval. So it's interesting. The market was just starting to work. I've been asked what software tools will help with drug development. Well, just about anything. The statistical programs were the big ones, and computers themselves, when I came in, that was a big help. And now some of the biggest ones, believe it or not, are the ones that deal with preparation of huge documents, because when there is a new drug to be approved, the drug companies send literally 2 truckloads of paperwork to the FDA. You can imagine the management hassle with that. So it's just amazing. Most people have no idea what drug companies have to do to put something on the market. And because it's so difficult, complex, and costly, only blockbuster drugs are developed anymore. I had something when I was in the business. The FDA actually paid a personal call to me. They phoned me and said, the examiner for my section phoned me and said, Dr. Ruwart, I understand that you've developed something for liver disease that might actually reverse liver disease or at least help patients with it. And we're really thrilled here at the FDA because, we don't, there's nothing for it. We want to help you. We want to do anything we can to help you get through the system. Well, of course, I was overjoyed. But the problem was that even though they wanted to help us get through the system was so big and bulky, and liver disease at that point had never been successfully treated. So we didn't know exactly what parameters we had to look for and how many patients we'd need and how long we'd have to treat and what dose we'd have to have in order to have a successful study that was statistically significant, which is what the FDA requires, a certain statistical significance. If we missed any of those parameters and got them wrong, we'd have to do the study, which took years, over again. If we had to do it over again, our patent would expire and the drug would go generic the minute it hit the market. We'd never recover our development cost. So we never developed it. This is how new drugs, really get innovation gets taken off the shelves before the consumer doesn't even know it. No one ever knew that. So that's the way it goes, and people are still dying of liver disease. So I'm noticing it's 1:52, so I only have a couple minutes for more questions. So let's see if there's anything else that anyone would like to hear. I'm being asked where on the web is the most medically rich information. I would say it depends what you're looking for. Now, I see that the chat room has offered some suggestions for regular medicine. I'm going to offer you one for alternative medicine, or actually a blend, I should say, of alternative medicine and what we would call traditional or standard medicine. So I like Life Extension Foundation. It's actually run by libertarians who decided that they wanted to optimize their chances of living well and living long. And they've developed a nutritional company called Life Extension. Now their website is lef.org. lef.org. And I'm suggesting you go there not only because they sell vitamins, but they also have a lot of information. It's probably the most information-rich site that I trust to give me information on nutritionals as well as the interface between pharmaceuticals and nutritionals. Now they're very hard on pharmaceutical companies. And one of the things I need to talk to them about a little more is a recognition that the regulations have shaped the industry and are really driving the industry, which is too bad because it's no longer about saving lives. It can't be. It's got to be about getting enough return on your investment to cover the costs so you can stay in business. Okay, so I'm getting a little note from our leader here, George Donnelly, who, thank you, George, for setting this up. It's a wonderful experience. I'm going to close. But before I do, I just want to thank you all for coming. I want to invite you to check out my website to get those free downloads we talked about at ruwart.com. That's RUWART.com. And I hope that you've enjoyed the talk.